Hi, everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. We've got the graveyard shift here, right, during lunch, so we'll make sure to keep it extra entertaining. So like Daniel mentioned, my name is Kyle Harrison, and I run the environmental markets team at BNEF. And while this is technically the first BNEF Houston Summit, we've had a couple of BNEF Houston forums over the last few years, and I've been fortunate enough to attend those events. And it's pretty remarkable what can change in a year, right? What we're talking about during this event is so different than previous Barrel of Tomorrow events. And I think that's kind of representative of how much the energy system has changed, right? Not just in the United States, but around the world. The whole morning, right, we were talking about power demand growth and how for nearly a decade, power demand was relatively flat in the United States. And for the first time in many years, it's expected to grow. And we think that data centers, for example, are going to make up 9% of US electricity demand in 2035. But you also have demand drivers like increased industrial and manufacturing and fleet electrification that are all changing the energy system. Anyone that is a major energy consumer, right, they're going to want to go ahead and in many cases, and they're going to want to try to purchase clean energy or zero carbon-free sources of power. But as we also heard this morning, that's equally as complicated due to policy constraints, due to transmission issues, due to permitting, due to supply chains, buying clean energy, investing, for example, in nuclear projects. None of these are easier things to do. And what that means in a lot of cases is you're going to also have a lot of sources like natural gas and LNG feeding a lot of this increased power demand. And so what this new energy system creates is a new dilemma for anyone that wants to have a low carbon solution or offer a low carbon solution, or they want to achieve any type of sustainability goal. Enter carbon removals, right? This calls for a more immediate solution to addressing this kind of new energy system. And this is a brand new market that's scaling up very rapidly. And we've got 4 organizations here that really represent kind of the key architects of the carbon removal market. And so today we're going to talk about what does it take to scale this market up to a multi-gigaton market on an annual basis? What does the market look like today? And what cool innovations are we seeing to drive this market forward? And so I'm joined once again by Angela Schwarz, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Anew Climate. We've got Tom Montag, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Rubicon Carbon. Brian Mars, who's a Senior Director for Energy and Removals at Microsoft. And then finally, we have Anthony Cottone, who's the President and General Manager of 1PointFive. Thank you guys so much again for joining us.
Pleasure.
Brian, I want to start with you. So I think when anyone thinks about carbon removal, Microsoft maybe is the first organization that comes to mind. I see every single week a new deal announced by Microsoft across a whole different range of sectors all around the world. And I definitely want to talk a little bit more about those deals later on. But maybe to start, what's underpinning all of this activity from Microsoft?
Yeah, look, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. And thanks to my fellow panelists in the audience. In 2020, Microsoft had an ambitious multi-decade program announced, namely to be carbon negative by 2030 and then net or historic carbon negative by 2050. And so in pursuit of that program, we did our corporate climate math, and we realized that there's at least 4 main missing markets towards hitting our target. And the first 3 are reductions, and we are a reduction-first program. So to your point, we're not relying on removal to hit our goals entirely, but we're prioritizing reduction. So those reduction missing markets are clean energy, which is maybe not a missing market, but certainly a maturing one, depending on where you are in the world. Clean materials. So we build data centers all over the world. We have hundreds of data centers under construction in at least 40 different countries right now. And so they require steel and cement and concrete and other materials that we want to become zero carbon over time. And then clean transport and mobility. And so when we look across those and the ultra hard to abate reductions within that carbon math, carbon removal plays a special role in backstopping our 2030 target to a small percentage. And then when we look at our 2050 target, the only way you can address emissions that have already happened is through carbon removal, where you're essentially positioning carbon removal like a time machine over the next 25 years to look at when the company was founded in 1975 all the way. So I guess we're a 50-year-old company as of this year. This is 50 years of Microsoft. So by Microsoft's 75th birthday, the idea is we would have removed our Scope 1 and 2 emissions to be historically net negative. So those are the 2 primary motivations in how we've done the carbon math and mapped out or back-solved what we need to purchase, very similar to how we constructed our clean energy program.
And how has that target changed, right, given kind of the current energy system and how power demand is growing, right? I know you've heard this from a lot of major tech companies over the past few years that the goals that they set in 2018, 2019, it's a different playing field. So how has that kind of changed within the organization?
Yeah, so when we announced our carbon negative targets with the 2030 and 2050 target, we described it as a moonshot. And I think we've said recently the moon does move in this context. I think we're still figuring out how much. But, you know, the last 5 years have taught us that business progression and sustainability progress are nonlinear. And so thinking about the collaboration that we have on this panel here, we're looking for nonlinear solutions, 10x plus solutions that can help us catch up and scale. So, in other words, we're watching this. We know this is a multi-decade program. We're not scoring ourselves too hard in year, but we are looking at the direction of travel and making decisions on that basis.
Speaking of 10x solutions, Tony, tell us a little bit more about 1.5, and then how does 1.5 fit under the broader Oxy umbrella and the broader strategy for Occidental Petroleum?
Great. Great to be here. I'm Tony. I recently took over the role of president for 1.5. And so we're actually at this very pivotal moment, I would say, in our history. We're transitioning from prove that direct air capture works to actually building a scalable, repeatable business that's really going to be focused on the global regulatory markets around carbon. So 1.5 is Oxy's direct air capture company. I think to put this into context and frame the conversation up a little bit, I like to start with what we have proven to date so far. And so what we've demonstrated is that direct air capture is no longer theoretical. So our first facility is Stratos. It's 500,000 tons of capacity. That is currently being commissioned today. Just within that same facility, we're demonstrating that there's already cost down from the first phase to the second phase. The number of air contactors that we're using from phase 1 to phase 2 is already a reduction of 30%, and that's a major component of the cost. The other thing that we've demonstrated is that we've secured demand for our product. No one really knew what direct air capture was just a couple years ago, and so we have about 30 different customers that have actually done deals with us before even the plant is operational. It's a really actually big feat that we achieved there. The other thing I like to point out is that direct air capture is actually bipartisan here in the U.S. And you've actually seen it actually improve here over the last couple of years and the support for it. But probably most importantly is the resilience that we see in this market. It's not just about the U.S., it's actually a global market. And so what we had to do, we had to set out and prove that direct air capture could be part of the global decarbonization tool, something that policymakers around the world could see and feel and touch and understand that's real. And so that's why we built Stratos. And like I said, it's currently being commissioned and on track to be online by the end of this year. Within the context of Oxy, why is Oxy doing this? Oxy has a long history of actually utilizing CO2. We're the largest consumer of CO2 in the world. There's no one that knows how to handle, transport, drill a well 5,000 feet down into the earth and understand and predict how that CO2 will migrate through rock over time. And so when it came to our blueprint for decarbonization, we thought about where can we get involved where we can accelerate the technology 5-10 years, something that won't be done without our involvement. And direct air capture was one of them. And so that's why Oxy got involved there. It also supports our core business. Like I said, we consume more CO2 than anyone else. And so the vision we have here is that differentiated commodities actually arise from using direct air capture CO2 within our reservoirs over the long term. And through that, we can actually generate a higher growth rate for our core business.
Fantastic. And I definitely want to talk a little bit more about innovative financing and kind of how you bring the cost down for these technologies. Tom, moving over to you now. So Brian sits on one end of the value chain, Tony's on the other end. Rubicon Carbon is kind of in the middle here as more of a broker, advisor, originator of carbon credits. How have you seen your business change over the past couple of years as this energy system has shifted?
Well, we're not really a broker for that. We were set up by TPG in 2022. Both Angela and I have TPG as owners of our companies. And the idea then was that this was one, the market was a good market, and two, the voluntary carbon market was necessary in in what was going on in the world because of all this insetting wasn't going to be enough to get us to net zero. And so we started the company, and that we would be the person that would help people find projects that were good to buy, for sure, but we would buy those projects ourselves. So we would buy them into Rubicon, and we would issue what we call Rubicon carbon tons. So we have a nature-based, emissions-based, and removal-based tons, where we actually own the tons, and they've gone through our science team. So we put together a great science team that helps us look at every ton, write a report on every ton, which you can read, scores it on our scale, and if it qualifies that it's in the Rubicon carbon ton, and you can buy that ton. It's like an ETF. So you're buying a diversified portfolio of products around the world that we've done. And while you own it before you retire, if something happens, we're taking bad things out and putting new things in. And so, and that's the kind of thing that we actually, like ByteDance bought from us, where they bought the Rubicon carbon ton. And then we introduced the further risk adjustment of Rubicon carbon ton, and then we did the Rubicon rated ton. You know, we keep doing things to try to get people that don't have the heft to do their own science, that are smaller buyers, to give them the integrity into the market. And so with B0, we worked together to have a rated ton, which is rated AA, where we would take our projects and their ratings and put together portfolios, similar to the finance market, where people would want to have a AA bond portfolio or a single A bond portfolio. We would create that for them. So that's kind of how we started. And now we do that, and we go to source. So we quickly realized that we needed also to help get good projects going around the world, because there wasn't enough that we thought, quite frankly, met our standards. And so we then become more of a financier as well, where we invest at source and buy offtake agreements with projects around the world.
And I definitely want to dig into the Rubicon carbon ton a little bit later on as well, because that de-risking is so essential to unlocking that kind of second tier of companies that maybe don't have as much experience in climate or nature or any of these engineered removal solutions. Angela, moving on to you now. I'm not going to say exactly what Anew does. I don't want to get that wrong, like with Tom.
We're
but,
not a broker
yeah.
either. I can
But we do know that Anew, again, similarly sits kind of more in the middle of this value chain, and you've been in this industry for quite some time. How have you seen it change, and how has Anew seen this market change over the past few years?
Yeah, we've been at it a long time, since, it's coming up on 18 years, so it's been a long time on the carbon journey. I think the last 3 years have been incredible, the amount of change that's taking place. We focused really, and I know we're talking about engineered removals, but at Anew we've really been focused on nature-based for quite a while, and through all the changes that had to take place about transparency. And so when I think about the biggest evolution really has been in providing integrity into probably one of the most, you think about R&D of a tree, we've been at it for a really long time. We understand how to grow trees, we understand why they grow, and I think we've got the science down behind it. What was missing was the integrity and the transparency into how the carbon accounting was working. And I had a conversation, I think you heard from Dan Amman this morning. I met Dan when he was running a low carbon fuel solution at Exxon. And he was new, and I was going to go educate him. And he asked a series of questions, and if anybody knows Dan, you know that he's very direct, and he is wicked smart, and he had a series of questions, and I couldn't answer those questions with the level of integrity that I needed to answer him. So I took a step back, knowing that you don't give Dan a half answer. Went back to our Houston office, got our scientists and our PhDs and all our tech people in a room, and was so sure I was going to get this incredible answer to return to Dan. And what I got was tacit agreement that his questions needed to be answered, and that the technology was there to do it, and that the willingness in the market was there, but that we had protocols that didn't require that level of integrity. And so we at Anew set out on an 18-month journey. We've invested tens of millions of dollars and hundreds and thousands probably of hours, and have now advanced improved forest management to a level of transparency that we think is on par with some of the more measurable technology solutions. And it's a very scalable market, and with that level of integrity, and that's one of the reasons why we've recently announced a deal with Microsoft, is we were able to hit those integrity levels with our removal program. So that to me has been the biggest shift, is to use technology so that we can bring transparency into a very willing market at a cost that is coming up the abatement curve correctly, but that is still within reach for a lot of the budgets.
Yeah, when you think about nature-based solutions, We're talking about, theoretically gigatons of potential scale
Absolutely.
again that can be unlocked, but you need that transparency, you need measurability, you need to prove that permanence. All of that's absolutely essential to this discussion.
At the same time, you're addressing the biodiversity and the community needs and the ecosystems and water, and so it is really a holistic solution to I think a problem that just continues to run out in front of us.
Absolutely. So a big theme here has been innovation, right? And to me, when I think about the carbon removal market, it reminds me quite a bit of what we saw with corporate power purchase agreements many years ago, right? So you had a lot of companies, and this is still an incredibly active market, even more so now, companies going out and signing these long-term agreements for solar and wind, typically for their Scope 2 emissions. And to me, the carbon removal market is very similar. You can make a lot of comparisons in how you financially structure these agreements. You can even make similar comparisons in who's trailblazing in this market. And so, Brian, I wanted to come back to you and Microsoft, who had a lot of experience in building out that carbon removal market. How are you applying learnings from that to the corporate PPI market, How are you applying learnings from that market to the carbon removal market?
Yeah, great question. We're certainly students of history on this, and I think that carbon removal is the new corporate PPA in terms of driving that next generation of additionality, driving the carbon math forward towards net zero, and in our case, carbon negative. So I do think it's that powerful. How do you think about building a portfolio of over 15 to 20 different carbon removal pathways? And we score every deal that we look at on its cost, time to market, because we do have time-bound goals, and then also ultimate scale potential. And we have a very involved due diligence process that can take months, if not longer, for every single deal up front, often using third parties. So just to her point on integrity and understanding the science behind everything we sign, that's probably the biggest difference between a traditional diligence process for a corporate clean energy deal. But when Microsoft started on this journey, we really put forward three main, what we think of as commercial principles, I guess. One is we take a portfolio approach. So we don't follow a picking winners model where we just go with one type of CDR. And so we want to spread out execution risk, we want to spread out tech risk, and we're not going to, it's almost like we're a VC or a portfolio manager on that front. And then second, we really look to send our demand signal out into the market. So by signing those long-term deals, this is probably the most similar function to corporate PPAs. You're sending out that signal for innovation with partners that can then mobilize private capital into the market and figure out how to hit the scale and timelines that we're looking for. And then the last piece is we try to build the markets we buy from. So we publish our due diligence. It's on our website. We have core science principles around how we think about structuring these deals. And just like our program is following climate science and that we recognize the role carbon removal has to play, not just in our own corporate goals, but in the temperature targets with the UNFCCC, we also want to make sure that we're building a path for others to follow here that follows science, that can balance that with commercial goals, and is something that more and more buyers can follow ahead. So in other words, blazing a path. And it does really remind me of, I think Microsoft signed its first corporate clean energy deal in 2014, so long ago, and I won't say the price of that deal back then, but in any case, we're kind of in that moment here, a decade later with carbon removal, where we're just getting started.
Yeah, well, and you talk about price, right? And the private sector was essential. If you look at the learning rates for solar and wind, obviously technology plays a huge role in that, but the private sector was essential in bringing down those costs, right, through innovation. And you can make a very similar comparison to engineered solutions like DAC, right? It has a really high cost point right now, but I think you speak to a lot of folks in the direct air capture industry, and they have this North Star of $100 a ton, or they want to bring down costs significantly, right? How do you get the private sector, Tony, excited, and how do you get them to purchase these credits from, these larger, kind of more nascent projects, and how do you make that bankable?
Yeah, you're pointing out some of the challenges when it comes to getting the customer engaged, I would say, in a direct air capture story and narrative where this is all about getting the cost down. And so we expect cost down to be over 50% over the next, through 2030, let's just say. I'm just estimating. How do you get a customer to sign a long-term PPA on that? So while direct air capture looks like there's a lot of steel and there's a lot of cement and it looks like an infrastructure project, there's actually no Tokyo Gas on the other side that is signing a 25-year offtake agreement to keep on the lights in Japan. And so that's fundamentally one of the problems when it comes to financing these projects. We take a view that you actually have to sort of solve for capital recovery around a 5-year period, and I think that's probably all that customers in the voluntary markets are really willing to go out. I don't see at scale where you can fill up a 500,000 ton facility at 10 years of term. Like it's just not present today. So we need to transition this not from a voluntary market, but to a global regulatory market where there's actually mandates. And so that's where we're positioning our product towards mandated markets where we compete well with things like sustainable aviation fuel and decarbonized fuel in the marine industry. I would just say, like, I think it's a bit of a myth out there that direct air capture is going to be bankable. Whether it's because of this cost curve, price curve coming down pretty dramatically over time, that means that the technology is changing very quickly, right? And so a bank is not going to step in front of that technology curve. But then it also comes to the point of the value chain for direct air capture has not been broadly activated yet. So what you see out there is announcements from small companies that are trying to do it, right? They're working on a project in Wyoming and they said, I guess we were just a little naive about this whole sequestration thing. And so they delayed the project. The next thing that happened is they were unable to get a PPA to supply it with power. And so they canceled the project. And so I would say direct air capture is 20% about the technology. It's 20% about being able to do sequestration integrated into that. The conflict of interest between those two parties is enormous. A direct air capture facility sells their credits at $1,000 a ton. The sequestration party gets paid $35 a ton. That is asymmetric risk. That is extremely difficult commercially to get by. And the sequestration partner holds the bag on it. They're the one with all the liabilities. And so the economics have to be aligned between those parties in order for this industry to scale. So that's 40%. So capture, sequestration, building $1 billion facility, like that's for a big company to do. And so the startups are having a very difficult time scaling that up, operating a plant for 25 years, and then finally selling these types of credits, very difficult to do. You've got to wrap all those things into a balance sheet, right? Because you're making guarantees, whether it's to the PPA provider that you're going to actually offtake that electricity, or to that sequestration provider, you're going to say, hey, I'm actually going to supply you with the CO2 so you could sequester it. So there's all these different things that go into financing these projects. The only thing I have been able to figure out is that it's not done at the project level. It has to be done actually at a top co level over time, where the interests of all the investors are aligned, because what project equity wants to invest in the first plant? The whole point of direct air capture is to make that first plant obsolete. And so basically the entire fleet needs to be owned by one aligned party.
Now, those are all great points. And one thing that specifically stood out was that a voluntary market is not going to be the thing that drives direct air capture scale up. And you need that regulatory backstop. And that's why you're seeing, for example, really positive developments in the EU for the emissions trading system and potentially allowing carbon removals there. That maybe sends a healthy demand signal to the market. Yeah. Maybe pivoting more to nature-based solutions. Angela, how does the financing and the innovation in nature-based solutions differ from, say, engineered removals? What are you seeing there?
Well, there's a very different cost basis. It can be as simple as the cost can range from actually acquiring the land to just developing on somebody else's property. What we've done in Anew is we've invested in a TIMO, which is a Timber Investment Management Company structure. And its revenue was 100% based on timbering. And over the course of the last 2.5 years since we've owned the properties, we've converted that revenue over to carbon. So we took a large working forest, there's 57 properties that are involved, and made that conversion. So that's a very expensive way to generate those same concepts of how you take a forest and you change it from a timber-based revenue to a carbon-based revenue. It's all the same principle, and it's around preserving and making the forest more healthy. And as we talked about earlier, that includes all the biodiversity from it. So we have a different capital structure based on whether or not you're going to own the land and actually convert and manage the revenue, or you're going to cohabit on a working, which is very different from some of the cost basis for engineered. The volume of credits that come out, we're the largest generator of removals, or so I'm told by our marketing group, and I think the number's right. We're the largest generator of removals today in the world. And, you don't think necessarily the forest is doing that. I know Tony's going to probably put us down in the standing when, DAC is online, but today it is an extremely valuable source of removals. But I also don't want to leave out conservation tons, and I know we're not talking about them today, but that is an important part as well of the IFM, or the Improved Forest Management Strategy.
Yeah, I don't think we have enough time to get into the avoidance versus removal discussion, but I absolutely would have loved to. Maybe in terms of scale, right, Tom? Rubicon has signed a very large deal with Microsoft for future delivery of millions of carbon credits. How do you all invest in projects and get involved at such scales?
Well, it's a long process, because we go all over the world to find. So with them we set up a framework, and there's a lot of that is the science framework and what they want the project to do. So not only do they have science people helping them, but we also do the same due diligence ourselves. So there's 2 reports on every project that we do as we go around the world. And then we also have to think a little bit about the financeability of that project and all the geopolitical risk. I'm used to taking risk in my life, but some of the risks here are quite large geopolitically, and you have to get out of that mindset where we've invested in projects already, not necessarily for Microsoft, but for ourselves in South Africa, in Panama, Peru. We're looking at things in Ghana, Uganda, Indonesia, etc. I'm used to the world where you're wanting them to pay you back. So the risk is I'm not going to get paid back. Here we're not asking. We're actually investing in the country. We're planting trees in degraded forests in the country, and we're hiring people in the country. So we're not trying. It's not like we're not mining. We're actually investing in the country. But it's hard to get financiers to want to go in those with us. So we have the TPG, but we're trying to bring people in and finance to go into these projects with us. It certainly helps to have an offtake agreement with somebody to do that, but the time that you have to invest before you actually get money out, it's quite lengthy for people, right? And so these are 20-year contracts. Trees have to grow before you get your credits. So, and there's risk during that time period. So, we look at that, and we also use the insurance market where we can to help us augment that, to lessen the risk for ourselves.
And one persistent theme that's come up with all of you is that to be active players and architects in this market, you need to get really in the weeds on projects, right? You're talking about due diligence in sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah. Angela, you mentioned working with scientists and really getting in the weeds on these projects, and very similar comparisons on the engineered removal side with just negotiating these really long, lengthy deals. What does the future of this market look like? Is this going to continue to resemble a securities market? Are we talking about a commodities market in the future? How does that change? And whoever wants to take this one, feel free, but very curious on what does the future direction of travel look like?
Well, at least from my perspective, one would be more clarity around carbon accounting and how that works for everybody. I think a lot of people are caught in this, the SBTI world, and can I use, can I not use, how do I use it? Are these protocols right? I know there's a group being set up now to look at carbon accounting in a different way. So part of it just the carbon accounting and getting clarity around what's acceptable for people and how they're going to use it. I think that's one of the risks people have about buying, because they're afraid that's not going to be allowed. That'd be one thing. And two would be some kind of standardization. I was thinking about bonds and green bonds. Bonds were fine. You bought a bond from somebody and you hope you paid you back, and you look at their credit risk. And there was all these things underneath bonds that people looked at. And then they invented green bonds. And I was at Bank of America. We did more than anybody green bonds. But there were standards that you had to meet to be called a green bond. And I was just thinking while I was thinking about that we have carbon tons now, and in theory, every carbon ton is the same thing. That's what the registries say. But we have like 10 different registries, or whatever we have, and then we have different standards all the time. And there's no standard that says this is a green ton versus a regular ton, or something like that would let people have a core core, something core to hang on to do it. I think that'd be great. The other thing that's always bothered me about this market is that there's no, unlike the, if I ask you, Kyle, do you want $1 today or $1 in 20 years? I think you'd say, give me your $1 today, please. But in our market, like if Microsoft saves a ton now, it's actually more valuable than if they save it in 20 years. But we don't give any credit to the person that's doing it now versus the person that's doing them. And it doesn't make sense to me. If you're going to be science-based, why is the value of it? And in fact, not only do we not do that, that if it's more than 5 years old, people say, I don't even want it anymore. When in fact, in theory, all else equal, that ton, if that's a real ton, has actually provided more value than the ton you're buying today. And somehow we have to get, I think, to those things. I always laugh because I started my life in derivatives where I said all I cared about was basis points, and now all I care about is molecules. I mean, it's so weird. It's just so small, but it's like even the future value of carbon, I think, should have a value, and that would help, I think, our market.
Yeah, perfect. Well, I'm not sure green bonds is the best market that we want to compare the carbon removal market to. But nonetheless, I see your point.
No, you know what
yes.
I mean.
Of course, yeah.
There's a lot of work getting done on ledger accounting, and
right.
I think that's what you're talking about, the EIF
Yep.
Foundation and e-ledger. And it's a very intuitive way of tracking carbon through product or service as opposed to how we have it compartmentalized today. And as we head more and more in that direction, we have a universal language that can be used. Policy and frameworks will fit in under it, so it's not directing policy, it's creating a common language and vocabulary that we can use and measure. And I caution everybody, if you can, read as much as you can about Carbon Ledger and the EIF Foundation work, because I think it's going to be a game changer.
I think we've got some audience questions potentially. Yeah, Tony, if you wanted to make a really quick comment.
We have lots. All right. So a technical question. What's the difference between putting post-combustion capture equipment on a gas plant versus building a direct air capture plant 10 meters away on the same gas plant? And would both scenarios qualify as carbon removal?
I think that's for me.
That's you.
The difference is you would never build that direct air capture plant right next to a gas plant. The whole point of direct air capture is to build it right on top of geology that can secure that. And so unless this gas plant has won the geologic lottery and they've for some reason built that gas plant right on top of a saline aquifer, then you're talking about building long-haul transportation to a site that might be hundreds of miles away. And so what I fundamentally actually believe, and because I've worked on point source capture deals, is that the cost of them is inherently underpriced. It's not just about capital, it's not just about OpEx, it's about where it's located in relative location to a sequestration site, but it's also the contractual relationships around getting a point source capture project to work. And that's because there's feedstock risk. If you're dealing with an ethanol emitter, their cycles look like this. And so whenever you're building a capture facility on the back end of an ethanol facility, you're taking on ethanol risk. And that ethanol emitter, their board, their management team, they need to agree to a supplier pay contract to make the economics of that capture and sequestration site actually work. And so there's actually hidden liabilities, there's contractual performance guarantees that are required that are almost as large as your capital and OpEx actually. And so our theory, our vision actually is that emitters that aren't close to those geologic sites, that don't want to invest the capital and midstream assets like a capture facility, they're actually just going to opt to do direct air capture as a service instead of investing that capital and paying the OpEx instead.
You got time for anything else?
We have more, yeah. Another question on the affordability of carbon capture. How high could the regulatory backstop cost be without significant adverse effects?
What? I couldn't hear the last piece.
Without severe adverse effects.
How high could the regulatory backstop cost be without significant adverse effects? For example, a minimum credit price for removals.
For example, a what? I'm sorry?
Let me repeat the whole
This is a tough question.
How high could a regulatory backstop cost be? For example, a minimum credit price for removals. How high could that regulatory backstop go without causing significant economic or political pushback?
what's the highest price carbon could be at before you have political blowback?
I'm going to leave that to Kyle to interpret.
Is that the question?
It depends by industry and how that cost perhaps is being passed on eventually to the consumer, I would say. And that is going to get into the carbon intensity of that industry. So if you're thinking about shipping and maritime, you know, that backstop isn't really that expensive. And that's because it's not a very carbon intensive activity in terms of shipping goods because it's very efficient. And so you might see like a 1 cent addition to your like Nike shoes being shipped. When it comes to aviation, obviously that's a very carbon intensive activity for anyone. You're going to see that being passed on to the consumer in some way. And that could be, you know, $10, $20 on the ticket price. I'm not sure if that answered the question, though.
Maybe just to really quickly add to this, you're absolutely right. I think it's about how it impacts the consumer. And a great example of this is EU ETS 2 in Europe, which is expected to launch in 2027. This is a regulated carbon market for transport and buildings. The price of carbon is forecasted to reach 122 euros in 2030. And all the member states are terrified that that's going to roll down to consumers. And so you're getting a lot of pushback from EU member states as a result of that. And so if it's a consumer-facing industry, right, that maybe that threshold for what that carbon price is a little bit lower. But if you're looking at another market where the consumer is not directly as impacted, I think you have a little bit more wiggle room for that price to go up higher. And that can unlock things like DAC, SAF, all these other technologies.
Kyle, back to you to close out.
Perfect. All right. So we're at time here, but like I mentioned at the very beginning, right, this is a market that we think could scale up significantly over time by orders of magnitude, and these are the architects of the future of this market, right? So if you have any questions about this, please feel free to reach out to them. I know I just made sure that they're going to be leaving the event a couple hours later as a result of this, but yeah, if everyone could please join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you.